Welcome to topic 7.4 on the progressives. So, the progressive era marked a transformative period in American history, reshaping government policies, social structures, and environmental attitudes. By the end of this lecture, you will understand how progressive reforms addressed political corruption, economic inequality, and social injustices, and how these changes impacted America's political and environmental landscape. Let's dive in. So, first of all, the progressive era was born out of the challenges of industrialization and urbanization. Cities faced overcrowding, poverty, and corruption, while industrial workers endured harsh conditions. Earlier reformers like Henry George from Progress and Poverty criticized the inequities of wealth, while Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward envisioned a utopian society free of exploitation. Jacob Riis highlighted the realities of urban slums and How the Other Half Lives, using photographs to expose squalid living conditions. This work inspired widespread reforms in housing and sanitation. The Muckrakers, those are investigative journalists of the progressive era, and you could think of them as, imagine muck, it's like mud, and you're raking away all the mud to see what's really going on there. They delved into the dark corners of society. Lincoln Steffens exposed municipal corruption in The Shame of the Cities, while Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Company revealed the ruthless practices of John D. Rockefeller. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle brought attention to unsafe working conditions and unsanitary practices in the meatpacking industry, leading to landmark legislation like the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So, who were the progressives? Progressives were primarily urban, middle, or upper class reformers who believed that the challenges of industrialization and urbanization required government intervention. Women played a crucial role, advocating for temperance, suffrage, and labor reforms. Progressivism wasn't confined to one political party, but influenced both political parties. So key progressive presidents included Theodore Roosevelt. He's going to be the main one that kind of got the ball rolling. And remember, he came into presidency because McKinley was shot. Okay, and so had that not happened, we might never have started down this progressive road. So we start with Theodore Roosevelt, and then we have William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. So we have Republican, Democrat, all of them were progressives. Now, they were progressives in different ways. Roosevelt and Taft were similar. In some ways, they were similar. Taft kind of is not progressive enough, and so Roosevelt's going to come and challenge him later on. But Wilson is more of an economic progressive. So they enacted reforms that tackled corporate greed, expanded democracy, and improved social welfare. Progressive rejected laissez-faire policies, and laissez-faire policy, remember, that's a policy that the government would have about business. Just let business alone, do whatever they want to do. If they want to hire young kids to work in a dangerous factory, they can do that, but the government shouldn't interfere. So progressives rejected laissez-faire policies and believed government should actively correct social wrongs. And it's going to grow out of the populist movement of the 1890s. Remember, there was a populist party at that time. And some of the general goals of progressivism. So first of all, to protect social welfare, addressing industrialization's impact, they sought government assistance for the poor, improved working conditions, and reduced child labor. So they wanted to promote moral improvement. So the temperance movement and other initiatives targeted issues like alcohol abuse and poverty. Create economic reform. Progressives called for regulations on big business to ensure fairness and limit exploitation, and to foster efficiency. Reformers pushed for streamlined government and business practices to eliminate corruption and waste. These reforms were designed to make America a safer, fairer, and more democratic society. So some of the debates among progressives. So, so first of all, there were disagreements over segregation, political participation, and immigration. They didn't always agree. So for segregation, some progressives supported or ignored segregation, while others opposed it. Remember, especially in the South, there was segregation. Like, for instance, there would be like a bathroom for white people and then a bathroom for black people, a drinking fountain for black people and a drinking fountain for white people. And so you would think that anybody that wants to improve society would be against segregation. However, the Democratic Party was not against segregation. One of the reasons is that their power base was in the South. And so and for this reason, that's one of the reasons why for someone like Woodrow Wilson is going to focus mainly on economic issues instead of social issues in regards to progressivism, is that he does not want Democrats, especially people in the South, to think that he is going to go for something like ending segregation. Okay, another one is political participation. Debate existed over whether reform should prioritize popular participation or rely on expert governance. Now, so there are things like direct election of U.S. senators. Okay, so that was something that is going to change. It used to be that people didn't vote for their senators. It was the state legislatures that chose the senators. Women weren't allowed to vote. And so that's something that's going to change. Another thing that's going to change is primary election. So the person who would get to be the Republican or Democratic nominee for president or for any other seat used to just be chosen by the party bosses. And so you could only really then choose from among the people that the party bosses chose for you to choose from. And so what is gradually going to happen, and now happens everywhere, is there's something called a primary election before. There's a preliminary election before the general election. In the preliminary election, the candidates for each political party are chosen, and then those candidates run against each other in the general election. Okay, another one is immigration. So progressives were divided, with some advocating restrictions and others supporting immigrants' rights. So these internal debates highlight the diversity of the progressive movement and its varying approaches to reform. So some of the national goals of progressives. So, as I said, direct election of senators would make them responsible for the people, and that's going to be the 17th Amendment. So before the 17th Amendment, the other state legislatures chose the senators. So what that means is, for instance, let's say Nevada has the Nevada state government. So the Nevada state legislatures would choose who get to be the senator. So the Senate, under this system, became the Millionaires Club. But now that people directly get to choose senators, those senators are responsible to the people. Before, they weren't. Okay, another one is women's suffrage. Remember, suffrage means voting rights. And so obviously the direct election of senators happened. It was the 17th Amendment. So women's suffrage, they granted women the right to vote. That's the 19th Amendment. Leaders in women's suffrage were Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Julia Ward Howe. And then fighting corporate and government corruption, and a group of writers exposed unpleasant truths about the American way of life. Probably the biggest one that we would see with that would be something like, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And so Upton Sinclair, he was one of those muckraking journalists. He wrote a novel that exposed the truth about the squalid conditions in the meatpacking industry. So there'd be like rats running around in the place, in the factories where they would pack meat. And so, the meat would sometimes have maggots in it, and there'd be blood everywhere, extremely unsanitary conditions. And after he exposed this, to make a long story short, laws were passed, as we mentioned earlier, to clean some of that up. So these were some of the goals of progressives. Now, here are some other goals of progressives. So direct primary, as I mentioned earlier, would allow voters to choose candidates for government offices instead of caucus or convention methods. So right now, there's basically two elections for office. There's one election in which you vote, like if, let's say you're a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian, you're just going to choose, let's say you're a Democrat and it's a presidential primary. You're going to have like 5 different Democrats that you can choose from, and you're going to choose one, and the person who gets the most votes gets to represent the Democrat Party in the general election, which will come a few months later. So that's a direct primary. Before that, it was just party bosses, a caucus or a convention, in some back room, some smoky back room, they like to say, who would say, well, we're going to pick Garfield to be our next presidential candidate, okay? And so now you have direct primary. So it makes things more democratic. So initiative and referendum. So all laws are to be placed on the ballot for final approval by the people. So an initiative and a referendum, these are 2 different ways to put laws. Like an initiative, I think what it is that you force the legislature of a certain state, you propose a law, and then the legislature has to vote on that law. That would be initiative. Referendum is a little bit more serious. This would be something where the law itself is put on the general ballot and the people themselves get to vote on the actual law. Now, it's usually not all laws. I don't know of any place where all laws are done by initiative and referendum. Also, recall elections. So people have the power to remove a public official from office. When I lived in California in the 2000s, I think it was Gray Davis. We'll have to look that up. But he was recalled. He was the governor of California. Nobody liked him. He was recalled, and he was replaced by, guess who? Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay, the secret ballot. This is something that we take for granted today. So used to counteract boss rule. And so what that means is when you vote, no one else can watch you vote. You go into like a booth where no one can see, and no one gets to really know who you voted for. Now, you can look up somebody's name and see if they voted or not and what political party they belong to, but you don't get to see who they actually voted for. And so if you could see who somebody is voting for, or if somebody could just stand there and point to a name and tell you who to vote for, then that would enable what's called boss rule. Remember people like Boss Tweed? He could have people there to bribe people who to vote for. So bribery is going to be less effective if the briber can't tell if he's getting what paid for. Secret ballot means he can't watch his person vote. Okay, one of the most famous reform governors was Robert M. La Follette, and he led the way in regulating big business. Progressives also lobbied to protect workers and to end child labor. They were successful in winning a 10-hour workday, workers' compensation to aid families of workers who were hurt or killed on the job, and reform mayors of cities like Detroit. Some issues, what were they? Fair tax structures, lowered fares for public transportation, and war on corruption. Parks were built, and utilities like gas and waterworks were publicly owned. All right, now we're going to look at Theodore Roosevelt's role in national progressivism. And remember, probably the main catalyst for progressivism was Theodore Roosevelt himself. He's probably going to do more than anybody else to uplift the lives of common Americans. And so the Square Deal, that was President Theodore Roosevelt's domestic program aimed at providing fair treatment for all Americans, balancing the interest of businesses, workers, and consumers. It encompassed 3 main goals: controlling corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. Remember those 3 things. Controlling corporations, so you're going to think of things like the Sherman Antitrust Act, breaking up these huge trusts that are using these monopolistic practices. Consumer protection, think of things like protecting consumers from bad meat, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and conservation of natural resources. So with things like mining, there's a practice called strip mining that takes basically a very large chunk of the forest, maybe where there's coal underneath it, maybe in Pennsylvania, such as anthracite coal, and just stripping the topsoil off of it to get to the coal instead of digging a mine like a tunnel down in. This is strip mining. It strips the maybe the top 50 feet of soil off a huge area and to get to the coal beneath. And so that's going to practices like that, not just in strip mining, but in all kinds of other things that businesses are going to be doing to take natural resources out of the earth. And Teddy Roosevelt wants to conserve these natural resources. So let's look at some of these aspects of the square deal. And when we get to the coal strike of 1902, that's where we're going to see it the most. So what is the Hepburn Act? So the Hepburn Act of 1906, that's going to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission, giving it authority to regulate railroad rates, ensuring fair prices for farmers and businesses. So what's the big deal with that? So if you remember, farmers were often overcharged for shipping things like wheat. So you had wheat farmers in the Midwest, and there was one way that they could get their product to the market, and that was through the railroad. And since the railroad had a monopoly, the railroad could just charge farmers whatever they wanted and really jack up the prices to the point where farmers were going out of business, defaulting on the loans that they took out to buy their farm and the equipment and things like that. While at the same time, people like John D. Rockefeller, because he had a monopoly, was able to twist the arm of the railroads and get all these big rebates who were basically shipping his things at cost. Okay, so the Interstate Commerce Commission says if you ship things over state lines, that's interstate commerce, the Constitution of the United States gives the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce. Okay, so that's one thing that the Hepburn Act does. It gives it authority to regulate railroad rates. Another thing, it extends the ICC, remember that's the Interstate Commerce Commission, oversight to other industries like pipelines, that would be to move oil, ferries, and storage facilities. And it marked a significant increase in federal regulatory power to curb corporate abuse. So that's going to be big, especially for farmers. Okay, now another big thing is going to be the coal strike of 1902. So this is going to be a major dispute, and it's going to involve 140,000 coal miners demanding higher wages, shorter work days, and union recognition. So they're going to be, Roosevelt himself is going to intervene, and this is going to be this is going to mark the first time a president mediated a labor dispute. And so why would a president think that he could get involved in business like this? The whole idea is that this was before, remember this is in 1902, and so this is going to be before most people have electricity to heat their homes. And so people are going to be heating their homes with coal. And so if you don't get the coal out, when winter's coming, people are not going to be able to heat their homes. And so it would be a national emergency if people weren't able to heat their homes. Okay, and so now usually when the president would intervene, it was just really president would send in the army or send in the National Guard or send in the militia to break up the strike and return control of the property to the business owners. Okay, Roosevelt's not going to do that. So what he's going to tell the owners of the coal mine is, I'm going to give you an option. So you have two options, okay? Option number one is that you can meet with the union, and I'll send in mediators, and my mediators will listen to you, listen to the union, and we'll work out a deal. Option number two is that I'm just going to take over the coal mine, and we'll get the coal out. I'll hire the workers, and you won't be in control of the mine anymore. And so the owners of the coal mine chose option one, and the idea was that they came up with a deal that felt fair to both the coal miners and somewhat fair to the owners. Now, both groups kind of walked away angry from this meeting, meaning that they didn't get everything they wanted, right? And so if you have one group happy and another group sad in a meeting like this, that's not good, because that means you have a winner, right? But to give everyone what you could call a square deal, and both groups are walking away angry, that means that no one really got everything that they wanted, which is kind of what Theodore Roosevelt wanted to happen. He wanted a square deal. Square here kind of means it's fair. Okay, we're not ripping off the owners of the business. We're not ripping off the employees, the union members. Everybody is kind of getting a square deal. So the resulted in a compromise. The workers received a 10% wage increase and a 9-hour workday, though the union was not officially recognized, and it demonstrated Roosevelt's commitment to fairness and labor for business. Okay. So next is the Department of Commerce and Labor, and this is going to be in 1903, and it's established to monitor and address disputes between businesses and workers. It included the Bureau of Corporations, which investigated corporate practices and ensured compliance with antitrust laws. And so this is really going to signal Roosevelt's belief in using government's oversight to promote fairness and economic stability. And that's going to go into the next thing, which is the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed all the way back in 1890. And so it's going to be passed way before his presidency, but it doesn't really have any teeth to it, because it'd be kind of like, let's say for those of you who drive, if there was a law that said the speed limit was like 45 miles per hour on the freeway. Well, that's way too slow, right? But also there were no cops to pull you over if you sped. Well, what would everybody do? Everybody would just go 75, right? And so if that's basically what the Sherman Antitrust Act was, it was a law that didn't have any provision or very weak provisions for its enforcement. It's hard to prove that somebody is acting as a monopoly in a trust, because remember, a trust is a group of corporations that are overseen by a board, and they're kind of acting together, like in concert, to do the monopolistic practices of driving other businesses out of businesses so that you can buy them up and make them part of your trust, right? And so you have to really track down receipts and figure out through an investigation that a trust is operating as a monopoly and therefore should be broken up. And so because the Sherman Antitrust Act did not have those cops checking the speed limit, so to say, it was not very successful. So he's going to strengthen federal enforcement by using the act to dismantle powerful trusts. And the first one is going to be the Northern Securities Company. So he's going to target monopolies that abuse their power. So the Northern Securities Company is a massive railroad trust, and it was broken up in 1904 by a Supreme Court ruling. So other major corporations like Standard Oil faced scrutiny under his administration. And he emphasized fairness, distinguishing between good trusts, which benefited the economy, and bad trusts, which exploited consumers. And so he broke up something like 45 trusts, and his predecessor, William Howard Taft, is actually going to break up more, but he's the one that got the ball rolling. So the trust buster reputation really rests with him, and he earned that nickname for breaking up 45 monopolies during his presidency, something like that. And he asserted that the government had a role in ensuring fair competition and preventing abuses of power. So his trust-busting effort set a precedent for future administrations to regulate corporate behavior. Now remember, he is a Republican, but he's more of an old-school Republican. Remember when the Republicans started, they were the party of Lincoln. They were the party of ending the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, making progress for African Americans, the party of Reconstruction, the party of ending slavery, giving African Americans the right to vote. And after Reconstruction, it becomes like a big business party, okay? Not laissez-faire so much as the Democrats were. I mean, both parties were in support of business and not in support of the common man during the Gilded Age. But the Republicans wanted the government to actively intervene on behalf of business, do things like break up strikes and things like that. And so the fact that Roosevelt is more of an old school Republican, in fact, he remembers, he was actually there for Abraham Lincoln's funeral. In fact, there's a picture of him actually being there, Teddy Roosevelt. And so he looked down upon Lincoln's funeral, and this is one of the reasons why he wanted to be a Republican, is that he admired Lincoln. And so, but at the same time, what I want to kind of foreshadow here is that there's going to be a lot of friction between Teddy Roosevelt and the business interest aspect, the pro-business aspect of the Republican Party, because he is a progressive Republican. Remember, progressives at this time can be Republicans, they can be Democrats, they can be in the Populist Party, they can be in the Socialist Party with Eugene Debs. But we can think of Teddy Roosevelt with his strong personality being kind of like the catalyst for all of it. Okay, consumer protection. So he's going to respond to public outcry over unsafe food practices after works like something that we talked about was called Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, exposed some of the horrendous practice in like the meat packing industry, like rotten meat being packed and sold to people. So he's going to sign the Pure Food Drug Act and the Meat Inspection. That's 1906. And also 1906, this is going to be the Meat Inspection Act to ensure food safety, hygiene, and truthful labeling, and created lasting federal oversight of consumer goods, laying the foundation for modern regulations. Okay, conservation of natural resources. So this is going to be very, very big with Teddy Roosevelt. So you can see here, Teddy Roosevelt is hunting. This is bad trust, things like this, good trust. He's not really hunting them. He's hunting the bad trust. And so why is this picture here? Because, for instance, when Teddy Roosevelt stopped being president, he went to Africa and started hunting big game. There's like pictures of him with a gun and with a hat like that next to an elephant or a rhinoceros or something like that. And this was really before a lot of these animals were going extinct. And he would send these the specimens that he killed to the Smithsonian for further research. So it wasn't just useless violence against animals, but so he was a big hunter, and him being a hunter, he didn't want the environment to be all used up so that further people couldn't go out and kill stuff like the way that he did. So what you're going to find is that a lot of hunters are very, very big, not so much environmentalists, but conservationists in the fact that they want the natural environment to stay open for hunting, because you couldn't do your sport of hunting if everything was deforested, okay? So he's going to believe in the balanced use of natural resources to benefit both current and future generations. Today we'd call that sustainability. So he's going to establish 5 national parks, 150 national forests, and 51 federal bird reserves to protect wildlife and natural areas. And he's going to work closely with conservationists like Gifford Pinchot to implement sustainable land management practices. So he advocated for wildlife protection and protecting endangered species, preserving natural habitats, and he signed laws to restrict hunting in protected areas and designated over 230 million acres for public conservation use. Okay, so also balanced use, the Hetchy Valley debate. So a conflict over the use of Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. Preservationists led by John Muir, and he's probably the most famous preservationist of all time. They wanted to keep it untouched. So conservationists, including Roosevelt, supported using the land for a water reservoir to benefit San Francisco. Ultimately, the valley was dammed, meaning that it was used for a water reservoir, reflecting Roosevelt's belief in balancing environmental protection with practical resource use. So the conclusion for Teddy Roosevelt's national progressivism is that the Square Deal highlighted Roosevelt's progressive vision, emphasizing fairness, regulation, and stewardship of natural resources. His policies addressed corporate abuse, improved consumer safety, and laid the groundwork for modern conservation efforts. Okay, now on to the national progressivism of Taft and Wilson. So William Howard Taft is going to follow Teddy Roosevelt as president, and then we're going to have Woodrow Wilson. And so William Howard Taft continued the progressive agenda initiated by Theodore Roosevelt. He's going to focus on economic reforms, very much on antitrust enforcement, and then the establishment of significant policies aimed at regulating corporations and taxations. So, as far as economic reforms go, Taft prioritized economic regulation and fairness, building on the progressive momentum of Teddy Roosevelt. And his administration sought to balance government oversight with business growth, particularly in areas like taxation and corporate behavior. So first of all, we have the 16th Amendment, and this is one of the amendments that we skipped over. Of course, we went over the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those were the Reconstructions Amendment. Then we went over the 17th and 18th Amendments just now. And now we're going to go over the 16th Amendment, and that's income tax. So before this, the United States government did not collect income tax, and it would not have been allowed it would have been deemed unconstitutional. And so, in order to collect income tax, particularly a graduated income tax, this amendment is passed. What is a graduated income tax? It means the more money you make, the higher percent of income tax you pay. And so now all of these robber barons, these fat cats, are going to be paying into the government a lot more, and so the government's going to have more money to help the little guy. And so that's the idea there. So it's going to be ratified in 1913, and it allowed the federal government to levy a progressive income tax, what I call a graduated income tax. It's going to replace older methods of raising revenue like tariffs. You can see today we don't talk as much about tariffs, but most of United States history up until this point, there's been a battle between tariffs and the business interests want tariffs because when you have a factory, you don't want countries who are more advanced from us, from Europe, sending goods in, and because their factories are more advanced, they can sell them at a lower price, and you don't want that to happen. And so what you would do is you pass a tariff, and that tariff is going to make the good coming from England or France more expensive than it would be normally, and they can't undercut American factories and American capital and American businessmen. And so tariffs were always seen as pro-business. And so think about that. The chief way that the United States is the federal government is getting revenue is through tariffs, and that's a pro-business move. It does not so much help the little guy because the little guy now has to pay more for the goods than he would before. Particularly, in a lot of ways, it doesn't help farmers. It particularly does not help subsistence farmers because subsistence farmers can't sell their stuff overseas, right? And so, or overseas things are not coming in for them. Anything that they would have to buy, for instance, like a steel plow, or we're pretty much beyond the point of having a lot of subsistence farmers, but I'm talking about earlier in U.S. history, subsistence farmers. So farmers would have been against a tariff. And so now getting rid of, now tariffs weren't eliminated by this. What was eliminated is the federal government having to solely rely on tariffs or mainly rely on tariffs as a source of income. And so now the federal government has an income tax. They can take a progressive income tax that takes more money. The more money you make, a higher percentage. And so wealthy people are going to be paying more than poor people. And so now instead of under tariffs, it was pro-business. This is pro-little guy, a progressive income tax. You can think of it as like that because if you're not making very much money, you almost pay no income tax. Okay, it's designed to redistribute wealth by taxing individuals and corporations based on their income levels, and it marked a significant shift towards addressing income inequality and funding federal programs. Okay, so the Sherman Antitrust Act. So Taft aggressively enforced antitrust laws and far surpassed Roosevelt's efforts. So he filed 70 cases against trusts in just 4 years, compared to Roosevelt 40, 45 in 7 years. So some of his notable successes were the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911. Now, the case against Standard Oil, of course, that's John D. Rockefeller, was started by Roosevelt, and but it's going to be broken up by Taft. Now, one of the things about this is at this time, let me see, the automobile is just coming into being, And so oil, if you could think that you could get really wealthy before the automobile, you could get very, very much more wealthy even after the automobile comes into being. And so Rockefeller is forced to sell off stock, break up his companies, but he's actually going to make a lot of money on it because the price or the value of the oil is going to really go up. So it's not like he's going to be super hurt by having to sell off stock. So the breakup of Standard Oil, that's a landmark Supreme Court decision that further clarified antitrust legislation. And so this is going to demonstrate his commitment to curbing monopolistic practices and promoting fair competition. And so remember, when we think about monopolies, when we think about trust, you should always think about monopolies, and you should always be thinking unfair business practices. So they're going to take a loss to lower prices for a while because they have a lot of capital, drive other businesses in the area out of business, buy up their business, and then jack up prices even more than what they were before they lowered them. And so that is what Taft here is going after, what Roosevelt is going after, breaking up these monopolies so that the little guy, again, this is another thing that's going to benefit the little guy, because if he's trying to get oil to heat his house or whatever he needs it for, and a monopoly comes in and jacks up the prices, he's going to be losing buying power. He's going to be losing money. Instead of spending that money on Christmas presents for his kids, he has to spend more money for the same amount of oil. And so breaking up that trust is going to bring competition. When businesses compete with each other, they have to lower prices. That's one of the things. There's only so many things you can do, right? And lowering prices is going to be one of them. Okay, so and then in 1909, there's the Payne-Aldrich tariff. So this is intended as a tariff reform measure. It aimed to reduce tariffs on certain goods. So it ultimately raised tariffs on other items, leading to widespread criticism from progressives. And this is going to be seen as a betrayal of progressive ideals, and contributed to the growing rift in the Republican Party between progressives and pro-business factions. And actually, there's going to be several things that are going to cause tension with Teddy Roosevelt. And so Taft was kind of like Teddy Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. So Teddy Roosevelt served 2 terms. He said, nah, I'm not going to serve another term. I'm going to go to Africa and go hunting on safaris. And so something like this is what's going to cause Teddy Roosevelt to want to come back. He forms his own party, actually called the Bull Moose Party, and he runs against Taft, and that's kind of like what let Wilson in, because had the Republican Party not been split like that, I think they could have easily defeated Wilson. So let's talk a little bit about Wilson's progressivism. So he's going to expand on progressive reforms, focusing on labor protections, economic regulations, and systemic reforms in banking and tariffs under his vision of the New Freedom Program. So what is meant by that? So New Freedom, that's Wilson's progressive platform aimed to dismantle monopolies, promote free competition, and implement economic reforms. So he advocated for small businesses and the protection of workers, emphasizing limited government intervention to create a fair playing field. So some of the economic reforms that focused on business and labor. So he's going to emphasize labor protections and stricter regulations on businesses to prevent exploitation and monopolistic practices. He's going to push for reforms to ensure fair wages, improved working conditions, and equitable treatment for workers. As far as tariff reform go, he's going to reduce tariffs to promote competition and lower consumer costs. So if you reduce tariffs, remember what I was saying is that the little guy is able now to pay a cheaper cost. And this idea that tariffs protect businesses, well, if businesses are forced to compete with international competition, a lot of times that's just going to force them to upgrade their factories, to spend more money on capital, to find a way to make better products at cheaper prices. And if they come out ahead, then what's going to happen is that everybody wins in that scenario. The little guy wins because they have a better product at a cheaper price, and the business is also going to win because now they've innovated and found a way without manipulating the market through tariffs to actually come out ahead. And so business interests would want tariffs, but that's not always going to be actually in their best interest. Sometimes lowering tariffs forces them to compete, and competition, necessity is the mother of invention. and competition here is necessity. Okay, so the tariffs are going to aim to decrease reliance on tariffs as a primary source in favor of income taxes under the 16th Amendment. So rules for banks. And so in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act established the Federal Reserve System. That's a centralized banking structure to regulate the money supply. So before this, it was on the United States was on the gold standard. You can remember William Jennings Bryan, you shall not crucify this man on a cross of gold. And the idea was that as more and more people came in the United States through immigration, and as more people were born through natural birth, the United States population is growing. But when you're on the gold standard, the only way that you can really add money into the economy is when more gold is discovered. And that is a very kind of a fickle way of deciding whether or not there needs to be more money into the economy. And so the Federal Reserve, whenever let's say there's not enough money, they're able to print more money and pour more money out there into the economy and release us from the gold standard. So created 12 regional Federal Reserve banks to oversee and stabilize the economy, and this allowed the government to manage inflation and deflation through monetary policy rather than, I was saying, just gold reserves, and ensured more consistent and predictable financial regulation. And then lastly, we have the Clayton Antitrust Act. So this is going to strengthen antitrust laws, and it's going to expand the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's going to prohibit specific monopolistic behaviors, including price discrimination, exclusive contracts, for instance, with railroad companies, where somebody like Standard Oil is going to have their stuff shipped at cost. The railroad company is not even going to make a profit. And then also mergers that are going to reduce market competition. So it's going to protect labor unions by clarifying that they were not subject to antitrust laws. And so it clarifies that the government is not going to try to break up labor unions, enabling workers to organize and strike without fear of being prosecuted as monopolistic entities. So overall, Taft and Wilson's progressivism is going to address very critical issues of their time, from breaking up monopolies to reforming the banking system. And Taft's economics reforms set the stage for Wilson's broader systemic changes that are going to culminate in a legacy of increased federal oversight and progressive economic policies. Lastly, we're here with conservation. So conservation was central to progressive reform. So alarmed by resource exploitation, reformers advocated for federal oversight. So it's mainly going to be Teddy Roosevelt. He's a staunch conservationist. He worked with figures like Clifford Pinchot to preserve over 150 million acres of forest land and establish national park, wildlife, refuge, and monuments. So overall, the progressive era reshaped America, addressing issues of corruption, inequality, and resource management. These reforms laid the groundwork for modern government policies and social programs. As we reflect on this area, consider its successes and limitations, particularly in addressing racial and economic inequalities. Thank you for joining us.